In 1944, a 14-year-old black boy was strapped into the electric chair. His feet couldn't touch the floor. The hood was built for a man. When the current hit, it slipped, and witnesses saw the tears on a child's face. His name was George Junius Stinney Jr. It was June 16, 1944, inside South Carolina's State Penitentiary. 5'1", about 95 pounds, a chair for men holding a boy. He had been condemned after a trial that ran only a few hours, with a jury that stepped out and returned in minutes. But was George truly guilty or a scapegoat for a town desperate for answers after two young girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, were found dead? 70 years later, a South Carolina judge vacated his conviction, calling what happened in that courtroom a violation of basic constitutional rights. Tonight, we retrace what happened to George and to the girls whose names must be spoken, step by step, from the first search to the last switch. Picture Alcolu, South Carolina, 1944, a company-owned mill town straddling the tracks that cleaved black neighborhoods from white ones. This was a place built for industry but governed by segregation and unspoken rules. Schools, churches, even playgrounds were divided by color, enforcing a rigid order where everyone knew their place. George Junius Stinney Jr. lived here, in a small rented house furnished by the lumber company where his father worked. He shared it with his parents George Sr. and his older brother John, younger brother Charles, 10-year-old sister Catherine, and 7-year-old Ruffner. Imagine the dusty roads, the scent of pine from the sawmill, the rhythmic chug of the logging trains passing on the tracks, not just a boundary, but a symbol of separation. Children played in dusty yards, their laughter drifting through humid air, while adults whispered about keeping in line. This was childhood, but not innocence. Here, small missteps could spell danger. The African American side of town felt fenced not just by rail but by fear. George's family was devout and diligent, parents earnestly trying to protect their children in a world that didn't grant them full humanity. The walls of their modest home absorbed prayers at night, the soft voice of saying grace over a modest supper, the creak of the floorboards as George tiptoed past to his siblings' room, secrets held in whispered lullabies. Could you imagine being a child in a world where even walking down the wrong street was dangerous? This sense of caution, of invisible boundaries, lingered in every step George took. Even the simplest act of letting the family cow graze near the railroad tracks could become grief's prelude. What if innocence could be mistaken for guilt, all because of where you stand, and how the world watches? In Alcolu, South Carolina, spring 1944, Betty June Binnicker, 11, and Mary Emma Thames, 7, set out on a simple afternoon mission, to find maypops. Bright yellow passionflowers often found growing near railroad tracks. As they pedaled along dusty lanes, they stopped briefly beside George Junius Stinney Jr., 14, and his younger sister asking, "Do you know where the maypops grow?" That fleeting moment, an innocent exchange among children, would puncture their lives forever. When the girls never returned home that evening, alarm spread like wildfire through Alcolu's segregated streets. Residents, including George's father and neighbors, formed a search party, calling out names into the frail twilight: Betty, Mary. Hope mixed with mounting dread as night fell, their voices swallowed by the hush of pine-scented darkness. At dawn, a pastor's son stumbled upon something heart-wrenching in a shallow, waterlogged ditch near the tracks, two small bodies, lifeless and broken. Betty's skull lay shattered, nothing but a mass of crushed bones, while Mary's skull bore a hole driven through into her brain and a long gash above her eye. The coroner concluded both had been bludgeoned with a blunt instrument, about the size of the head of a hammer. Within hours, shock turned to suspicion. No inquiry focused on adults. No other suspects emerged. Instead, attention zeroed in on a quiet black boy living just across those tracks. And within hours, suspicion turned not toward an adult, but toward a 14-year-old boy. Imagine the Stinney household unmarked on that spring day in 1944. George's parents were out, working at the sawmill. Suddenly, white officers arrived. His little sister, Am, cowered in the chicken coop as the men handcuffed George and his older brother. His brother was released. George was taken away. For hours afterward, he sat alone in a small, windowless room. No parents. No lawyer. No one to speak for him. Yet hours later, the authorities announced he had confessed. But here's the cruel truth: there was no signed statement, no written record, and no witnesses to corroborate it. His alleged confession remained undocumented, and the only evidence presented. Days later, as the trial neared, the Stinney family was torn apart. George's father was fired from his job at the mill. Rumors of lynching circulated. Within hours, the family was driven out of town under threats of violence. George was moved, alone, to a jail in Colombia, more than 50 miles away, supposedly for his own protection. Hasn't justice ever been a sanctuary? Here, it became uncaring and isolating. Now, picture being 14 years old, held in a cell far from home, stripped of support, forced to face a system that presumed guilt. Imagine, in that cold silence, clutching a worn Bible to your chest, the only touch of something familiar, as days stretched into uncertainty. Do you believe a child could fully understand what was happening in that interrogation room? Just 2 months after the tragic deaths of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, the case moved swiftly into court. In April 1944, George Junius Stinney Jr., still only 14, stood before a segregated legal system that had already decided his fate. The trial unfolded in overcrowded, white-only courtrooms, packed with roughly 1,500 spectators, every seat claimed by curiosity, conviction, or both. Georgia's black community, including George's own family, was forbidden from entering. The courtroom was not a place of justice but of performance. His court-appointed attorney, a local tax commissioner with political ambitions, did not file a motion for change of venue, offered no defense witnesses, and mounted no challenge to the prosecution's claims. There was no transcript of the proceedings, no written or recorded confession, and no independent evidence presented. The trial lasted only about 2 to 3 hours. After a perfunctory presentation and minimal deliberation, the all-white jury took just 10 minutes to declare George guilty. The presiding judge, Philip H. Stoll, imposed the death sentence that very day. George had been robbed not only of his liberty but of due process itself. And just like that, George was sentenced to die. It was the morning of June 16, 1944, in Columbia, South Carolina. George Junius Stinney Jr., a child of just 14 years, 5'1", and weighing a mere 90 pounds, was escorted into the electric chair chamber. This was no ritual, it was a grim inevitability. To secure him to the oversized chair, officials placed a Bible beneath him, serving as a booster seat so he'd reach far enough to be strapped in. As the switch was flipped and 2,400 volts surged through his body, the ill-fitting mask, designed for a grown person, slid from his face. In that final moment, witnesses watched in horror as tears welled in his eyes. It was over within minutes. He cried. He prayed. And just like that, he was gone. America had just executed its youngest person in the 20th century. In the quiet that followed George's execution, the Stinney family found no peace, only displacement. George's father, who had worked at the mill, was fired almost immediately after the arrest. With threats and violence swirling close, the family was forced to abandon their home and the company housing they'd occupied. Under constant fear, the family was driven out of Alcolu, their lives uprooted by accusation and grief. In the white-run town, the record of what happened was buried, literally and figuratively. The courthouse files, the inquest, even the testimonies vanished into opaque official archives. Silence prevailed. Decades passed, and Alcolu remained silent. From the local newspapers to state wire stories, George's name was never paired with innocence. Headlines grainy with accusation portrayed him as guilty, without question or nuance. No reconsideration of evidence, no doubt. Just a sealed verdict, printed and distributed freely. If this had been your child, would you have accepted the verdict, or fought the system? Decades after the electric chair silenced George Junius Stinney Jr. His memory still flickered in the whispers of those who didn't forget. It was the 2000s when the embers of that memory kindled hope again. George Frierson, a local historian who grew up near Alcolu, became one of the few to challenge the settled injustice, poring over the past and raising questions that refused to stay buried. He wasn't alone. Lawyers, Steve Mackenzie, Matt Burgess, and Ray Chandler, picked up the cause, joined by the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern University School of Law. Together, they propelled a motion for a new trial into court. Their argument? George had never received the fair trial guaranteed by the Constitution. They unearthed glaring gaps where justice should have stood strong: no physical evidence, no signed or witnessed confession, a trial that lasted just hours, and a defense that called no witnesses, especially his sister, Am, who later stated in an affidavit that George had been with her the entire day of the murders. In a courtroom filled with meticulous legal argument, survivors and historians gave voice to a truth long suppressed. Racial prejudice had woven itself into every layer of the case, from the exclusion of black jurors to the attorney's silence in defense. But it was in the testimonies of George's siblings where the emotional resonance cut deepest. Am and other family members described him not as a killer, but as a gentle boy who loved drawing and caring for his younger siblings, a child whose tender spirit had never belonged behind bars. Their voices, combined with the weight of injustice documented in the archives, swayed the court. And so, on December 16, 2014, Circuit Court Judge Carmen Mullen vacated the conviction. She ruled that George had been denied due process, that his attorney had failed him, and that executing a 14-year-old was cruel beyond measure. In her words, no one can justify a 14-year-old child being charged, tried, convicted and executed in some 80 days. But could history be rewritten after 70 years? 70 years after the tragic end of George Junius Stinney Jr., a measure of justice finally pierced the silence. On December 16, 2014, a South Carolina Circuit Court judge vacated his conviction. In her ruling, Judge Carmen Mullen wrote, "I can think of no greater injustice than the violation of one's constitutional rights which has been proven to me in this case." She emphasized that the trial had been riddled with procedural failures, chief among them, the complete ineffectiveness of his court-appointed counsel. His lawyer had conducted no investigative work, failed to request a change of venue or sufficient preparation time, called no witnesses, and did not file an appeal or stay of execution. These were not ordinary oversights, they formed the very essence of being ineffective. The judge went on to pinpoint the heart of the miscarriage of justice: fundamental, irreversible constitutional violations, including a coerced, undocumented confession obtained from a vulnerable child, an all-white jury in a segregated courtroom, and a trial more perfunctory than fair. That solemn day, George Stinney's conviction was vacated, declared legally invalid. His name was cleared. But the time for sentencing, prison, and execution had long since passed. His name, once stained, was finally cleansed. Yet the stark reality remains: his life was stolen. The record was amended, but the loss could never be returned. This exoneration was meant for history, not for George himself. Justice came, but not for George, only for history. Nearly 8 decades after his tragic execution, the story of George Junius Stinney Jr. resonates far beyond Alcolu. It stands as a painful marker of racial injustice, the fragility of childhood rights, and the terrifying reach of systemic bias. George's case now symbolizes the deep inequities of America's judicial system, especially in the handling of black youth. The image of a boy strapped into an oversized electric chair, his life extinguished without due process, has become emblematic of a time when race determined innocence, not evidence. His fate underscores how the death penalty for children was disproportionately applied against black and Latino minors. Between 1990 and 2003, 12 out of 19 juvenile offenders executed were from these communities, and 14 of the victims in those cases were white. These numbers aren't just statistics, they're echoes of the same prejudice that ensnared George. George's story has also inspired cultural works that seek to channel grief into reflection. The opera Stinney, an American execution, performed in Baltimore and Grand Rapids, casts his memory through music and conviction. Documentary filmmakers and poets have similarly invoked his name, as a solemn reminder of the human cost of injustice. On the political front, a lawmaker in South Carolina, Cesar McKnight, introduced the George Stinney Fund in 2022, a bill proposing $10 million in compensation to families of those posthumously exonerated after wrongful execution. It's a rare effort toward reparations that confronts history's wrongs with tangible acknowledgement. This case reveals the brutal reality of how systems designed to protect society can be twisted to destroy the most vulnerable. When prejudice meets power, innocent lives, especially black children, become casualties. Do you think something like this could still happen today? George Junius Stinney Jr. was just a boy who loved drawing, who tended the family's cow, who shared laughter with his siblings in a mill town divided by tracks and by law. A boy with dreams, with family, with innocence. And his story reminds us of a truth that echoes across generations: justice delayed is justice denied. His name was finally cleared, but his life was never returned. For George, justice came too late. For us, the lesson must come now. If this story gripped you, hit like, subscribe, and share. Every week we uncover another haunting case where truth and justice collide. And we'd love to hear your voice in the comments. Was George failed by justice, or by society itself? Let's talk about it below.